So, chapter 21 is our last chapter we have before the first lecture exam. This is our last chapter on the cardiovascular system. We're looking at blood vessels and circulation this time. So, the circulatory system is responsible for moving blood all throughout the body. And there are two types of vessels we have within the circulatory system. We have pulmonary vessels, which are responsible for moving blood from the heart to the lungs to get oxygenated. That blood goes from the right ventricle through the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries, which go to the lungs to pick up oxygen and then return that oxygenated blood back to the left atrium. Then we have the systemic vessels, which bring the oxygenated blood from the left ventricle into the aorta, which then passes the blood all to different parts of the body. Once that blood has gone to the tissues it's going to deliver its oxygen to, it then returns to the body and enters the right atrium chamber of the heart. And much like your heart itself, the circulatory system has pretty much synonymous functions with the heart. It's just now being covered to the entire body, not just the central region of the heart. So it's going to carry blood all throughout. It's going to be responsible for not only exchanging nutrients and waste products and gases, things like oxygen and CO2. It's also going to transport a number of other substances as well, things like hormones or neurotransmitters that need to be passed from one area of the body to another to initiate some sort of physiological change. Additionally, the circulatory system is going to regulate blood pressure by modifying things like resistance or flow rate. And it's also going to make sure that blood flow is, again, unidirectional. We want to make sure that the blood is flowing one way, that the oxygenated blood is going to our tissues, and the deoxygenated blood is coming back to the heart. So, in terms of the actual features of blood vessels, there are three layers to consider. So the deepest layer of the blood vessel is called the tunica intima. And that is the deepest layer. So think intima, think intimate in terms of closeness to the core. This layer has a lot of elastic tissue, allowing it to stretch and contract in order to change the diameter. There's the tunica media, which is a layer of smooth muscle cells. And this allows for a vasoconstriction and vasodilation of the blood vessels if it's contracting or relaxing. Then we have the tunica externa. Externa, think external. This is just a layer of connective tissue around the outside. And the first big grouping of blood vessels we have are your arteries. Your arteries are responsible for carrying blood away from the heart, getting oxygenated blood to the tissues they need to go to. There's three types of arteries. We have elastic arteries, we have muscular arteries, and we have arterioles. So when the blood leaves the heart, it actually goes in order of these arteries. So it goes to the elastic first, which then passes blood to the muscular, then to the arterioles. So elastic arteries, also called your conducting arteries, have a lot of elastic tissue instead of muscle, so they have a much more prominent layer of the tunica intima. And they are also of the large diameter. Next, we have your muscular arteries. So these have a much larger layer of smooth muscle in the vessels, which allow them to vasoconstrict and vasodilate, so to allow less or more blood to flow through. And these actually are a mix of medium arteries and small arteries that make up muscular arteries. Then we have our smallest type of arteries, which are called the arterioles. And these basically are just carrying blood from the small arteries, which are a type of muscular artery, to our capillaries, where the oxygenated blood is going to be dropped off to the tissues. Then we have two types of conditions that the arteries can undergo. So the first one is called arteriosclerosis. And this is when we have some sort of breakdown of the arteries, making them less elastic. And this can be due to long-term complications from things like high blood pressure or high blood cholesterol as well. And then we have what's called atherosclerosis. And this is basically a buildup of plaque along the artery walls. So if you see in the diagram over here, we have all this yellow gunk right here. That basically is just fatty tissue that's built up along the wall itself. That's then going to decrease the diameter and make sure there's a lot, and make it so that there's a lot less flow because it has to go through a narrow area. Over time, this can lead to complications like heart attack or stroke. And of course, having diets high in fatty foods can also lead to having more plaque along the walls. So if you ever heard someone say, don't eat that, that'll clog your arteries, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the plaque buildup along the artery walls. Okay, so once the blood has been passed through all the artery categories, so elastic, muscular, and arterials, we get to the capillaries, which actually are your smallest type of blood vessels among all the blood vessels. The idea behind the capillaries is that they are going to bring that oxygenated blood to the tissues to be used for cellular respiration, and they're going to pick up the deoxygenated blood, which is now lacking oxygen and has carbon dioxide or carbonic anhydrase, to then carry that carbon dioxide back to the veins, which will eventually come back to the heart. Okay, so the capillary network itself has a couple different pieces to it. So if we look up top in this diagram, we have your arteriole right here. That's the smallest form of the artery. It still has oxygenated blood in it. And that's going to pass through a smaller subpiece called the metarterioles into the capillary network. So arterioles to metaarterioles. And what is in the capillary network, there are two different flow patterns that can go through. There's what's called the thoroughfare channel, and then there's it can go around the channels through what's called intermittent flow. So if you look on the diagram, the thoroughfare channels are just these straight canals that basically run from the arterioles to the metarterioles all the way down until it gets to the venous portion of the capillary. Obviously, it's very steady, no interruptions. And then we have what's called the intermittent flow. This is basically when it doesn't go through the thoroughfare channel, it goes through one of these side channels through a structure called the precapillary sphincter. These are these little bunches of white, you see them circling here. So the idea behind the precapillary sphincters is that they're going to regulate blood flow, depending on if they're constricting or dilating. It's going to either prevent blood from going through or not going through. So if the blood flow goes through one of these side routes, it has to go through the sphincters, and ultimately the blood flow we sort of stop and go. So I'll have to wait for sphincters to open to be able to push blood along through the capillary. One more thing. Then once we have the oxygenated blood dropped off at whatever the capillary is surrounding, an organ system, tissue, whatever, that deoxygenated blood is going to be picked up by the venous capillaries, and then those venous capillaries are going to be brought to the venules, which are a type of vein. So your veins are responsible for carrying blood back towards your heart. And much like your arterioles, or your arteries, you have three types of veins. You have venules, which are the smallest of the veins. You then have small veins, and then you have medium and large veins. So in the same way that the blood flow goes from elastic arteries to muscular arteries to arterioles, we're now going from venules, passing the blood along to small veins, passing the blood along then to medium and large veins, then back to the heart. So venules and small veins, like I mentioned, the venules are at the end of the capillary network. That's basically where the capillaries drain the deoxygenated blood into. Those venules then feed into your small veins, which have a lot more smooth muscle along them, which allows, again, for vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And then your medium and large veins are basically just carrying the blood back to the heart. So medium veins are carrying the blood from the small veins to the larger veins, and those large veins are then carrying that blood from the medium veins back to the heart itself. And within your larger veins, anything above 2 millimeters, you're going to have what are called valves. So these valves are basically just two layers of the tunica intima, that's that deepest layer of blood vessel, sort of forming these flaps that overlap each other. And the idea behind the veins is that they're going to keep that flow, again, one directional, much like your pulmonary semilunar valve in the heart and the aortic semilunar valve in the heart. Those are going to make sure the blood is just going one direction and there's no backflow. Because your veins don't want any blood to flow back to the capillaries that's deoxygenated, it doesn't need to be there. Your body wants to get the deoxygenated blood back to the heart, so the heart can then get it back to the lungs and carry more oxygen to the tissues. Some other types of vessels that we have besides the veins and arteries and the capillaries are your vasa vasorum and your portal veins. So the idea behind the vasa vasorum is just that you have specific blood vessels that penetrate all of the other blood vessels and supply them with nutrients. So on the diagram of the blood vessel over here that I'm circling, you have the vasa vasorum here. You have the red vein or the red blood vessel that's carrying oxygenated blood to the vein or to the, sorry, let me start over. With the vasa vasorum, you have blood being carried, oxygenated blood being carried to the blood vessel, and then deoxygenated blood being carried away from the blood vessel. Just think of it as a blood vessel for the blood vessel. Even the blood vessels themselves need to have a fresh supply of oxygen in order to be sustainable. And then the second type of blood vessel is called the portal vein. And basically these are just veins that are connecting two different networks without any sort of pump. So there's no heart in this case that's pushing the blood through the vessels. It's just, the blood's just being carried through some sort of gradient, usually a pressure gradient. The most prominent example you have in the body is called the hepatic portal system. This lies between your small intestine and your liver. And the idea behind the hepatic portal system is that the blood vessels that are lining your small intestines are absorbing that nutrient-rich blood from any food you've broken down, and then any toxins as well within the system. And through the gradient, they're basically passing those nutrients and that toxin to the liver from the intestines. There's no heart or other mechanisms that's pumping that blood to the liver. It's just a gradient that's going down from small intestine to liver. Okay. So two types of circulation, as I mentioned at the top of the lecture. We have the pulmonary circulation. So pulmonary is to the lungs. This is when we carry blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk. That pulmonary trunk then divides into a left and right pulmonary artery, both of which go to the lungs. The lungs then deliver oxygen to the blood, binding to that hemoglobin. And ultimately, we have two pulmonary veins that exit the lungs and then come back to the left atrium. Then we have the systemic circulation, which involves the arteries. And the idea here is that we have this oxygenated blood is going to be pumped from the left ventricle into the aorta. The aorta is going to carry that oxygenated blood to the body. There's a couple different pieces of the aorta to highlight. So the ascending aorta is the immediate part that the left ventricle pumps the blood into. That ascending aorta has the left and right coronary arteries that branch from there. Remember, those coronary arteries are going to provide oxygenated blood to the heart wall itself, because every tissue in the body needs oxygen, even the ones that are responsible for pumping blood. Then you have your aortic arch, which comes after the ascending aorta, and that has three branches. You have the brachiocephalic artery, you have the left common carotid, and you have the left subclavian artery. And then lastly, you have your descending aorta. So this is now going to be going to the lower half of the body versus the aortic arch branches, which are going to pass blood along to the upper part of the body, the head, the limbs, and the neck. The descending aorta is going to pass blood to the thoracic aorta, which is right below the descending aorta. And then below the thoracic aorta is the abdominal aorta. So blood's going to go from descending aorta to thoracic to abdominal. And that's going to pass blood along again to the core, to the lower limbs, etc. Then with systemic circulation, we're going to return that blood from the body back to the right atrium to go back into circulation in the heart. You have a couple major veins. The first one is the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus dumps blood back into the right atrium from those coronary veins, which bring up the deoxygenated blood from the coronary arteries. Then we have the superior vena cava, which is the blood vessel that receives blood from the head, neck, thorax, and any upper limbs back to the right atrium. And then we have the inferior vena cava, which is bringing blood from the lower half of the body, so the abdomen, the pelvis, the lower limbs, back to the right atrium for the heart. So it all comes back to the right atrium. And we have three types of veins themselves. We have superficial, deep, and sinus veins. So your superficial veins are the ones that are closest to the body's surface. They're generally the larger veins in your body. They're usually the ones you can see on your arms or your muscles when you're flexing. You have your deep veins, which, as the name suggests, they are deeper in the body. You can't see them as readily. And then you have what are called your sinuses, which mostly exist in your heart and the cranial cavity.